Hi, today we're going to learn how to draw a cube. So we're going to start, as always, with our ground line, and that's just a light straight line across the page with our lightest pencil, and it's just an imaginary line showing where the object touches the ground. Next, we're going to draw the front edge of our cube, and we're going to use a ruler to make sure that line is nice and straight. And we're going to have it come down just a little bit below our ground line. Not too far unless you want to look like you're looking way down at your cube from up above, like this. If so, then you should draw that line pretty far below the ground line. But if you want it to look like you're just looking at your cube from a little bit more of a straight ahead angle, then you only want to have this line go a little bit below the ground line. Just depends on what you want. Next, we're going to figure out where the two side edges of our cube are going to go. So we're going to put two little dots equally distant from our center line. And from there, we're going to draw two straight lines up from the ground line. Make them a little bit taller than your center line. We're going to end up erasing part of them, so we actually don't know yet exactly how tall they're going to end up, but a little bit taller than your ground line. Next, we're going to connect the center edge of our cube to the two side edges. And then to figure out the top edge of our cube, we're going to draw a line from here that is at the same angle as the bottom edge below it. So what I'm doing is I'm lining my ruler up with that bottom edge, and then without changing the angle, I'm just sliding it straight up until it touches this top point of the center edge, and from there I'm drawing a line at that same angle. So it's very important that this angle be the same as the bottom angle. Next, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to line it up with the bottom edge of my cube and go raising it all the way up without changing the angle. And now I've drawn that top edge. Now to figure out where the back edges go, it's similar. I'm going to line my ruler up now with one of my side edges, and I'm going to move the ruler straight over until it touches this edge and it's at that same angle. So this line should be parallel to this line at the same angle. Then I'm going to do the same thing with this front edge. I'm going to just move it over here at that same angle. And now I've drawn in two parallel lines this way, two parallel lines that way. And sometimes it happens that your lines get just a little bit off in terms of the diagonal. To me, this looks like just a little bit funny. And if they get a little bit off like that, you can just lightly erase them, probably bring the center point down just a tiny bit and redraw them to make sure that those lines are really parallel. To me, those lines look more parallel than how I had them the first time. So if you need to make a little adjustment, just go ahead and do that so that your cube looks correct. Next, I'm going to figure out where my cast shadow needs to go. I'm going to do that by first figuring out where the imaginary back corner of the base of my cube would be. So however far the distance is from the ground line to the bottom edge of my cube, I'm going to go that same distance from the ground line up. So this space and this space are even. And that's going to be the imaginary back corner of my cube, as if it were see-through. Now I'm ready to draw my cast shadow, although I may need to just extend my ground line a tiny bit first. So I'm going to draw my light source up here to the top left of my object. And from there, oh, and actually first I can go back and erase any extra lines that were left over from drawing the edges of my cube. Now from here, to find the tip of my shadow, I'm going to draw a straight line from my light source through the farthest corner of my cube to wherever it touches the ground line. Let's make this a little smaller so you can see. And my ground line is just going to barely, or my shadow is going to barely fit on my paper, but I did make it so that it barely fits. So there's the tip of my shadow. Now to draw the sides of my shadow, I'm going to draw a straight line out from the front corner of the base and a straight line from the imaginary back corner of the base. And these two lines are also going to go out this direction, just parallel to the ground line. We don't know exactly how long they're going to be yet, so you can just draw them lightly going towards the edge of your page, and then we'll figure out the shape of the edge of that shadow. Now, since the edge of my cube is sort of this triangular shape like this, the tip of my shadow is going to have a similar triangular shape, and I'm just going to kind of freehand that with my ruler. I'm just going to draw in a triangle shape and a triangle shape. It's actually pretty similar to this line from my light source, and this is going to be the edge of my shadow, the shape of the front of the shadow. And now that I've got that in, I can go back and erase all my extra lines. So I'm erasing my center line right here because that was my imaginary ground line. I'm erasing the extra edges of the sides of my shadow. I'm erasing the line from my light source because that was just showing me where the tip of the shadow would fall. Now you can really see the shape of my shadow itself. I'm erasing the part of my shadow that would be behind my cube because I would not be able to see through my cube. It's a solid object. I'm erasing the imaginary back base of the cube. I'm erasing the rest of the ground line that I haven't erased yet, and any other extra little marks that I made in the process. And then I'm going to go back with my ruler, clean up any lines that I wanted to keep that got partially erased. But even though I'm putting these back in, I'm doing it really, really lightly because I want my final version with my shading to have no dark outlines, because dark outlines of objects or shadows do not exist in real life. So to make our drawing look really realistic, we're not going to include any visible outlines. And just to make sure that nothing is too dark, you might choose to go back over everything really lightly with your eraser one last time, just to lighten up your lines before you start your shading. So now everything is nice, light ghost lines. We'll zoom in a little bit here again so you can really see the shading that I'm going to do. So again, I'm going to start my shading with the cast shadow first. And as we know, cast shadows are darkest at the base of the object and darkest in the middle of the shadow. And so the darkness in the center of the shadow is going to sort of be similar to the shape of the outside of the shadow, kind of like that. That's going to be my darkest part. And then as I move to the edges of my shadow, I'm pressing lighter, 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 so that the edges and the tip of the shadow become very faint, light shading. I might need to darken up the center just a little bit more. But as you can see, there's no visible line between where the darker part of the shadow stops and the lighter parts of the shadow start. It's a very, very gradual, smooth transition. That's something that really helps your shadow look realistic. Now that I've done my cast shadow, I'm ready to shade in the darkest side of the cube. Now that's going to be this side here because my light is coming from the other direction, so it's not falling on this side. I'm going to use my medium pencil, which for me is my 2B. I'm going to start up at the top of this side of the cube and just using tiny little pencil motions, I'm going to create a nice even plane of medium value all the way down this side of the cube. On the edges, I'm being really careful to make sure that the edges are nice and crisp. I have a fair amount of shading practice, so I'm going a little bit faster than you should probably go. This step should take you a few minutes if you're really doing it carefully and correctly. And then as you start moving down to the bottom of this side of the cube, remember that your shadow is going to get a little bit less dark because some of the reflected indirect light that's bouncing off the ground is going to start filtering into your shadow. So as I get down towards the bottom, I'm just going to start pressing a little bit lighter, but this should be very subtle. Don't think that reflected light means you need to leave a white highlight at the bottom. It's still in shadow. It's just a slightly less dark shadow. So very, very subtle shift. I'm going back into my shadow, fixing up my shading, maybe pressing a little harder in some areas as I'm going back over them to make sure my shading is very even. And once I'm satisfied, then I'm going to move on to the next side of my cube. Now, since the light is coming from up above, the lightest highlighted side is going to be the top of my cube. I'm going to save that for last. I'm going to start now with the side that's mostly light, but not quite as highlighted as the top. So now I'm going to use my lightest pencil, which is my 2H, and I'm going to go in and do the same thing on this side that I did on my shadow side, where I'm just using little tiny pencil motions to shade in this entire side of the cube. And on this side, I should be doing pretty much the lightest shading that I can. Using tiny pencil motions, keeping that shading really even. And hopefully you made your lines on this side especially very, very light, so that as you're doing the shading on the edges, it's making those outlines start to disappear because they're the same value as your shading. So you don't have an outline, you just have a very crisp edge where your shading ends. Almost done with this side. Again, I'm shading a little bit faster than you should. You could probably get your shading to look even nicer than mine because you're going to go a lot slower. Okay, once I'm done with this edge of the cube, I'm going to move on to the final side. And this is my highlighted side. And on this side, I'm going to try to leave it as white as I can. I'm just doing some very subtle shading out from my edges just to kind of try to make my outlines go away a little bit. But I'm leaving a little space in the middle, pure white. Although it should be very, very, very subtle where my shading ends and my white starts. You shouldn't have a gray edge around the edge. It should just be very, very subtle shading. And now I have a nice, realistic cube. The last thing I'm actually going to do is just darken this edge up a little bit so you can really see that the top highlighted edge is a slightly different value than the edge on the side that's not being highlighted quite as directly. And now I have a finished cube.